The double doors of the courthouse groaned as they swung open, their echo bouncing against the paneled walls like thunder breaking the silence. Every head turned toward the entrance. The judge sat tall at the bench, attorneys had their folders, stacked in precise order, and the audience filled the gallery with murmurs that hummed like restless bees. The trial had been tense already, but what happened next turned the atmosphere into something unforgettable. It wasn't another lawyer striding in. It wasn't a late witness. It was a child. A little girl, no more than 8, stepped timidly across the threshold. Her shoes were scuffed from overuse, her simple dress too thin for the winter chill that clung to the air. Her braids hung loose. Against her shoulders, and in one small hand, she clutched a frayed teddy bear so tightly its seams strained. Each step she took seemed too fragile for the towering chamber. But she didn't stop. Her eyes were wide, shining with fear and determination. The whispers in the gallery cut off. Silence swallowed the room. Even the prosecutor froze mid-page, pen hovering over his notes. The child raised her chin toward the judge, her lips trembling as she forced out words that seemed impossibly heavy for her small frame. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying like a fragile hymn across the hushed room. "Don't send my daddy away." The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the benches, and the bailiff, startled, took a step forward. The gavel in the judge's hand paused midair, her expression shifting from authority to surprise. The man sitting at the defense table, Daniel Reed, flinched as if struck. His broad shoulders stiffened, his cuffed hands shaking where they rested, on the worn wood. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, telling him to stay calm, but Daniel couldn't tear his eyes away from the child. His daughter, her name was Maya, and she should never have been here. "Who let this child in?" the bailiff barked, moving to intercept. The judge raised a hand. "Stand down." Her voice was firm, but her eyes softened as they fixed on the small girl in front of her. "Let her speak." Maya hugged the teddy closer to her chest, her knees wobbling. Yet when she opened her mouth again, her words carried a strength that silenced even the creak of the ceiling fans. "They say my daddy did something bad," she said. "But he didn't. He reads me stories at night. He makes me breakfast. He's all I have. Please don't take him from me." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't cry. She stood there, shaking but unbroken. The prosecutor bristled. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. She is not a witness. This is nothing more than a—" The judge cut him off with a sharp glance. "And yet she is here. Perhaps we ought to hear what cannot be found in your files." Maya's words were simple, almost childlike in their plainness, but they struck deeper than any legal argument. The jury shifted in their seats, some exchanging glances, their expressions no longer neutral. Daniel bowed his head, fighting tears. He had endured the cold machinery of the system, accusations, procedures, the crushing presumption of guilt. But this was his little girl stepping into the storm meant for grown men, daring to beg for him. The courtroom no longer felt like a chamber of law. It felt like a battlefield between facts written in ink and truths written in the heart. The judge leaned forward. "Child, what is your name?" Maya swallowed hard. "Maya Reed. And why have you come here?" Her teddy bear pressed against her chest. She answered in a voice steadier than before. "Because if you take my daddy, I don't have anybody else. He's the one who makes sure I'm okay. He didn't do what they said. He's a good man. Please, let him come home." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the prosecutor, frowning, hesitated before shuffling his papers again. The defense attorney saw his chance, rising to his feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong yet measured, "you've heard arguments, evidence, statements. But what you've just witnessed is something far greater. The truth, spoken plainly, without polish or persuasion. A child knows her father better than any file or photograph could ever capture." The prosecutor sprang up. "Objection. This is blatant emotional manipulation." But again, the judge interjected. "Sit down, Mr. Cole. Sometimes truth speaks loudest through the mouths of those who have no agenda." The jury leaned forward, their attention no longer chained to the paperwork before them. They were listening. To Maya, to Daniel, to the beating heart behind the case. Daniel couldn't stay silent any longer. He rose slowly, the chains at his wrists clinking softly. His lawyer tried to hold him back, but the words burst from him. "Your Honor, His voice broke deep and raw. My little girl shouldn't be standing here begging for me. I know I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. But this I didn't do. I've been breaking my back at the factory, working night shifts, trying to keep her fed and safe. And if the only crime I've committed is being a black man walking home in a hoodie, then I already know what kind of verdict is waiting. His words hung heavy, heavier than the gavel could strike. The gallery stirred, a ripple of unease, sympathy, and reckoning spreading through the air. The judge's gaze lingered on Daniel, then flicked to Maya, who clung to her teddy with desperate resolve. This was no longer just a trial. It was a confrontation between law and humanity. And for the first time since the trial began, everyone in that courtroom felt it. The courtroom exhaled in a rush as the judge called a recess. Yet the weight of what had just unfolded clung to the air, heavy and inescapable. People whispered in hushed voices, reporters scribbled in their notepads, and the jury avoided each other's eyes, as if afraid to reveal what they were now beginning to feel. Daniel sat at the defense table, wrists still bound, but his back straighter than before. Maya's words had carved through his despair, reminding him he was more than a defendant in a cold trial. He was still her father. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The case no longer seemed like lines of evidence and procedure. It had become something raw, alive, personal. The prosecution wasted no time calling their star witness, the store clerk who had been injured during the robbery. A man in his late 40s shuffled nervously to the stand, his arms still wrapped in bandages. He cast a glance toward Daniel and quickly looked away, his jaw tightening. "Do you see the person who attacked you that night?" the prosecutor asked. The clerk's hand trembled slightly as he pointed at Daniel. "That's him. He came in with a gun, demanded money, and hit me when I tried to resist." The jury stiffened. Daniel's lawyer, Mr. Green, rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm. His eyes swept across the jury before focusing on the witness. His tone was respectful but edged with quiet steel. "Sir, let me take you back to that night. You told the police it happened quickly, isn't that right?" "Yes. It was over in maybe 2 minutes. You also told officers that the man had his face covered?" "Yes. A mask. One of those dark ski masks. And the lights in your store, were they all working properly?" The clerk hesitated. One of the overheads near the register was flickering, so it was dim. Mr. Green took a measured step closer. "So, in less than 2 minutes, in poor lighting, with the suspect's face covered, you're telling this court you can positively identify my client?" The clerk swallowed, shifting uncomfortably in the chair. "I recognized his voice." The defense attorney arched a brow. "His voice? Had you ever met my client before that night?" "No." "Then how could you possibly recognize his voice?" Murmurs erupted in the gallery. The prosecutor objected immediately. "Speculation," sustained, the judge said, but the doubt was already in the air. Mr. Green pressed on. "When the police asked you to identify a suspect in a lineup, how many men were shown to you?" 5. "And only one was wearing a hoodie, correct?" The clerk's lips parted, but no words came. His silence was an answer louder than any admission. The jury leaned in, eyes narrowing, the seed of uncertainty taking root. Daniel's gaze flicked toward Maya. She sat beside her aunt in the gallery, her teddy nestled against her lap, her small frame dwarfed by the wooden bench. But her eyes, wide, unblinking, remained on her father. It was as if her silent presence reminded everyone in that room that this wasn't a faceless case file. This was a family's life on trial. The defense then called their own witness, Daniel's supervisor from the factory. A middle-aged man, with oil-stained hands and weary eyes, stepped forward, nodding at Daniel before facing the jury. "Tell us, Mr. Lawson," Green began. "Where was Daniel Reed the night of the robbery?" "At work. With me. We clocked out together." Green walked closer. "Do you have proof of that?" The supervisor pulled a folded slip of paper from his pocket, handing it to the bailiff. It was passed to the judge, then shown to the jury. "His time card," Lawson said. "Stamped and signed. The robbery happened at 10:45. Daniel and I clocked out at 10:50. After that, I drove him halfway home." A murmur of surprise rustled through the courtroom. Green let the words hang, then asked, "Can a man be in 2 places at once?" The witness shook his head firmly. "No, Daniel was with me." The prosecutor scrambled to regain control. Isn't it possible the time was recorded incorrectly? Machines malfunction, do they not? Not this one, Lawson shot back. I've used it for years. Never failed once. The jury's faces told the story. They weren't buying the prosecutor's desperate attempt to sow doubt. When the defense rested, the courtroom buzzed with unspoken tension. Everyone was thinking the same thing. The case was crumbling. But what? Struck deepest wasn't the paperwork or even the testimony. It was the image burned into every juror's mind. The little girl standing alone in the center of the courtroom, pleading with trembling courage. The closing arguments began. The prosecutor straightened his tie and approached the jury box. His tone was measured, polished. Ladies and gentlemen, you must set aside emotion. The witness identified the defendant. He fits the description. Justice demands accountability. Do not let sentiment cloud your judgment. He spoke of order, of procedure, of how dangerous it was to let sympathy decide the law. But the words felt hollow, clinical, stripped of humanity. When it was Green's turn, he did not stride. He walked slowly, almost humbly, and rested his hands on the edge of the jury box. This case is not only about Daniel Reed, he said, his voice low but carrying. It is about the foundation of our system, the promise that every person is innocent until proven guilty. Yet too often, that promise is broken for men who look like Daniel before they even step into this room. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You heard testimony about time cards, about alibis, about dim lights and rushed identifications. But beyond that, you witnessed something no one here will ever forget. A child, standing before you, telling the truth the only way she knows how, from her heart. He turned, pointing softly toward Maya. She lowered her eyes, clutching her teddy, but her bravery was undeniable. She didn't come here to manipulate you. She didn't come rehearsed. She came because she believes in her father, because he is her world. And if this court condemns Daniel Reed without proof, then you are not just punishing a man. You are punishing a child who has already lost too much. The gallery was silent. The air vibrated with emotion. The judge dismissed the jury. As they filed out, the tension was so thick it seemed to cling to the very walls. Hours stretched like days. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the hum grating on every nerve. Maya drifted into a fitful sleep in her aunt's lap, her small hand still clutching her bear. Daniel sat motionless, his chains cold against his wrists, his eyes fixed on the floor. When the jury returned, the room rose to its feet. Maya blinked awake, rubbing her eyes, her little body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The foreman handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge's face betrayed nothing as she read, then handed it back. The foreman cleared his throat. On the charge of armed robbery? He paused, the air tightening with suspense. We find the defendant not guilty. The gallery erupted in gasps. Daniel's sister covered her mouth, tears streaming. Maya leapt from her seat and ran toward her father before the bailiff could stop her. She threw her arms around him, sobbing with joy. I told them, Daddy, she cried. I told them you didn't do it. Daniel dropped to his knees, burying his face in her hair as tears poured freely. His voice cracked as he whispered, You saved me, baby girl. You saved me. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the prosecutor lowered his gaze. The judge herself seemed moved, her gavel tapping softly, not to silence, but to steady the room. The echo of the words "not guilty" still hung in the courtroom long after the gavel had struck. The air felt different, as though every breath carried with it both disbelief and relief. People stood awkwardly, not quite ready to leave, whispering in tones of awe. It wasn't just a legal decision they had witnessed. It was a moment of humanity breaking through the cold machinery of the law. Daniel Reed remained kneeling on the floor, his daughter clutched tightly against him. Maya's small arms wrapped around his neck with all the strength she had, her teddy bear squished between them. He whispered into her hair, his words trembling but sure. You saved me, sunshine. You gave me back my life. The bailiff hesitated before stepping forward, as though unsure whether protocol applied anymore. With a quiet nod from the judge, Daniel's cuffs were finally removed. The sound of metal unclasping was like a chain snapping loose in his chest. He rubbed his wrists, red and sore, then lifted Maya higher into his arms. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a father again. His sister, Ruth, hurried forward, tears streaming down her face. She reached for his free hand, clutching it tightly. I knew you didn't do it, she whispered fiercely. I prayed every night. Daniel could barely find his voice. It wasn't just prayer, Ruth. It was her. He nodded toward Maya, who was still holding on to him as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. The judge rose from the bench. Her expression softened, her voice carrying a weight that reached every corner of the room. Mr. Reed, this courtroom has seen many cases, too many stories of broken promises and shattered lives. But today it has also witnessed courage. Your daughter reminded us all why justice must never forget its humanity. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but words failed. He simply nodded, clutching Maya closer as if she were the anchor that had kept him standing through the storm. As they exited the courthouse, the world outside felt overwhelming. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing like relentless lightning. Shouts filled the air. Daniel, how does it feel to be free? Do you believe the system failed you? What will you do now? Daniel paused, Maya's small hand gripping his firmly. He looked out at the sea of faces and raised his voice, steady but raw. I'm grateful, he began, the word heavy with sincerity. Grateful to walk out of here today and hold my daughter. But I need you all to understand something. This could have gone another way. And if it had, I'd just be another man lost to a broken system, another father stolen from his child. The crowd quieted, cameras still rolling. Daniel's voice grew stronger. The only difference between me and countless others is that my little girl had the courage to stand up here and remind you all I'm more than a case file. I'm a father, a worker, a man who wants nothing more than to raise his child in peace. But how many others never get that chance? How many daughters don't get to be heard? Reporters scribbled furiously, but Daniel didn't linger. He turned away, shielding Maya from the flashing cameras, and together they walked down the courthouse, steps into the cool evening air. The city lights glimmered against the darkening sky. Each breath felt like freedom. Each step felt like reclamation. Ruth walked beside them, her hand brushing Daniel's shoulder as if to remind him he wasn't alone anymore. That night, their small apartment felt different. The peeling paint on the walls, the uneven hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, none of it mattered. It was home. Daniel sat on the couch with Maya curled against his chest, her teddy bear tucked between them. She was half asleep, her breath soft and even. Ruth set a steaming bowl of soup on the table and lowered herself into a chair across from him. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but her voice carried a quiet strength. You know this isn't over, right? Daniel nodded slowly. I know. They'll forget you in a week. Reporters will move on. But the fight, it's still here. For men like you, for families like ours. Daniel looked down at Maya, her tiny fingers still clutching the fabric of his shirt even in sleep. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his voice almost a whisper. I can't change the whole system, Ruth, but I can change her world. That's where I start. Ruth reached across the table, taking his hand. That's enough. More than enough. For the first time in years, Daniel slept without the shadow of bars hanging over his head. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The case made headlines. Little girl pleads for father's freedom and wins. Maya's photograph, clutching her teddy in the courtroom, spread across newspapers and social media. Strangers sent letters of support. Some called her brave. Others called her a miracle. Daniel kept his head low, avoiding the attention. He returned to the factory, grateful simply to work an honest shift. But everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some offered handshakes. Others simply nodded, their eyes saying what words could not. One evening, as he walked Maya home from school, she tugged on his hand. Daddy, why did everyone clap when the man said you weren't guilty? Daniel knelt down so he was eye level with her. The autumn wind rustled through her braids as she tilted her head in curiosity. Because, he said softly, sometimes people forget the truth. They forget that not everyone who looks like me is what they assume. And you reminded them. You told them I was your daddy, and that was enough. Maya frowned thoughtfully. But you've always been my daddy. Didn't they know that? Daniel smiled sadly. Not everyone sees what's right in front of them, baby girl. Sometimes the truth needs a voice. She hugged her teddy tighter. I'll always be your voice. His chest tightened with emotion. He kissed the top of her head. And I'll always be your protector. But in the quiet moments, when the world wasn't watching, Daniel wrestled with heavier thoughts. For every man who walked free like him, countless others sat behind bars, men with stories untold, children waiting at windows for fathers who might never return. His freedom felt like a gift, but also a responsibility. Late one night, unable to sleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a worn notebook. The pages filled slowly as he wrote, not for himself, but for Maya. He wrote about the trial, about the injustice, about her courage. He wanted her to know when she was older that her voice mattered, that even the smallest truth could shift the world. And as the ink dried on the paper, Daniel realized that Maya hadn't just saved him. She had awakened something in him, a determination, not to stay silent anymore. Winter eased into spring, and with it came the slow thaw of Daniel's life. The cold weight of fear that had lived in his chest for months began to melt, replaced by something gentler, something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The headlines faded, the reporters moved on, but the memory of the courtroom lingered. Everywhere Daniel went, neighbors waved with new respect. Old friends who had once distanced themselves stopped to shake his hand. Even strangers on the street recognized him sometimes, offering a quiet nod that carried more meaning than words. But for Daniel, the only recognition that mattered was the way Maya looked at him every morning. Her eyes sparkled brighter, her smile stretched wider. She no longer asked in trembling whispers, "Daddy, are you going away?" Now she woke him with her laughter, dragging her teddy bear across the floor as she leapt onto his bed, shouting, "Come on, Daddy, we're late." Every morning, Daniel thanked God for the sound of her voice. Life was far from easy. The factory kept him busy, long hours under harsh lights, his hands blistered and sore. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries, and the whispers of judgment hadn't vanished entirely. Some still looked at him with suspicion, their eyes saying what their lips would not. A man like him doesn't walk away innocent. But Daniel no longer carried their weight. He had been judged by a jury, by a judge, and most importantly, by the unwavering truth of his daughter's love. That was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the tenements, Ruth set a small notebook on the table in front of him. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "You have a voice now, Daniel. People are listening. You should use it." Daniel frowned, turning the book in his hands. "What do you mean?" "Tell your story," she urged, "not just for you. For the men still locked up for crimes they didn't commit. For the children still waiting at windows. You and Maya, you could give them hope." The idea scared him. He was no politician, no preacher, just a man who had barely survived. But as he looked at Maya, drawing rainbows at the end of the table, he realized Ruth was right. His story was no longer just his. It belonged to her, too. That night, Daniel began to write. Words spilled onto the pages, raw, unpolished, but true. He wrote of the arrest, the fear in Maya's eyes as police tore him away. He wrote of the trial, of injustice disguised as procedure, and he wrote of the moment his daughter walked into that courtroom and, with nothing but her truth, shattered the walls that had nearly closed around him. Weeks later, Daniel found himself standing nervously in front of a small community center, filled with folding chairs and weary faces. Mothers, fathers, children, families who knew all too well the sharp edge of injustice. He clutched the notebook, his palms sweating. Maya tugged at his sleeve. "You can do it, Daddy," she whispered, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. He looked down at her, her faith steady as the ground beneath him. And for the first time, Daniel spoke his story aloud, not in the language of anger, but of resilience. "My name is Daniel Reed," he began, his voice carrying through the quiet hall. "And I stand here not because the system gave me mercy, but because my daughter reminded it what mercy looks like." The room leaned in. Every word he spoke wasn't just his. It was theirs. The nods, the tears, the murmurs of agreement told him he was not alone. His story became a mirror, reflecting back the pain and strength of everyone listening. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Not the loud kind, but the steady, rising kind that carried the weight of gratitude. People stood, some with tears streaming, others clutching their children tighter. Maya beamed, her little chest puffed with pride. "You did it, Daddy," she whispered. And Daniel realized she wasn't just his savior. She was his partner in something bigger. Months rolled by and Daniel's talk spread. Churches invited him, Schools asked him to share his journey. He spoke of bias, of resilience, of the way a child's voice could pierce through walls no adult could breach. Always, he told Maya's story. Always, he ended with the truth. Justice without humanity isn't justice at all. Maya grew into a symbol, the little girl who saved her father. But to Daniel, she remained just his daughter, the child who still asked for bedtime stories, who still giggled when he burned pancakes, who still climbed into his lap after long days, wrapping his heart in a love no system could ever take. On Maya's 8th birthday, Daniel saved enough to take her back to the park where it all began. The swings squeaked, the merry-go-round spun, the sky was painted in pink and gold. Maya ran across the grass, her braids flying behind her, her laughter ringing like music. Daniel sat on the bench watching her, his chest swelling with a mixture of joy and ache. Beside him, Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder. "Look at her," she said softly. "She doesn't even realize yet the mountains she's moved." Daniel's eyes blurred with tears. "One day, she will. And when she does, I hope she knows. I didn't just survive because of her, I became the man I was meant to be because of her." He rose, catching Maya at the bottom of the slide, lifting her high into the air as she squealed with delight. For a moment, it felt as though time had folded in on itself, the past and present meeting in one perfect embrace. Years later, when Maya would tell the story herself, she would remember not the fear of the courtroom, but the moment her father's hands shook as he held her after the verdict. She would remember the warmth of his chest as he whispered, "You saved me." And Daniel, older now, his hair flecked with gray, would smile at her retelling, humbled by the truth. He hadn't saved himself, his daughter had. And in doing so, she had saved something far greater, the belief that love, truth, and courage could still shift the weight of the world. Sometimes, the most powerful voices are the smallest ones. A child walked into a courtroom and reminded us that justice without compassion is hollow, that truth without love is empty. Daniel and Maya's story is not just about a verdict. It's about the courage to speak when silence is expected, the power of love to withstand injustice, and the reminder that hope often comes in the smallest packages, because sometimes, all it takes is one voice, one plea, one child's truth to remind the world of its humanity.